Hello and welcome to the Coffee and Comics Club. I am Todd A.
I'm Taylor Trask.
Good morning.
Here we are again.
We are recording this digitally.
Digitally. We had a joke back and forth earlier that Todd pronounced it digitally, and I told him he sounded like a great aunt. You're shopping for a birthday present for her estranged 12-year-old. Estranged 12-year-old.
Oh, the story gets even more layered. I'm gonna spoil this right now. I'm not drinking any coffee. What about yourself?
I am absolutely drinking coffee, Todd. It's a Coffee and Comics Club. And we're in the clubhouse, and I am drinking Nicaragua Segovia from our friends at Switchback Coffee here in the Springs.
Oh, wow.
If you've been listening to the last couple episodes, you know I am now completely decked out with all the accoutrements of a true coffee connoisseur.
Yeah.
And so I've got my burr grinder, I've got my little gooseneck pot, all that AeroPress. And I last week grabbed a bag of this. It's a light roast. And I bring this up because I've noticed I am more susceptible to the South American beans than I am the African beans. Not that I hate the African beans, but there's something about the way they roast and grow South American beans. There's usually a lighter texture and a kind of a fruitier texture that I really like. Seems like the African beans tend to go a little darker. There's a different quality to them that I almost kind of like more in the winter. I think it's hard to.
Interesting.
Like a warm, cold outside, warm inside kind of coffee. Whereas South American coffee, Mexico, Nicaragua, etc., Brazil.
That's
just naming random South American countries.
Mexico is in Central America.
Yeah. Central South. I'm kind of lumping it all together. Anything south of Texas, let's just say,
not American.
Not American. Certainly not Canadian. But no.
As a coffee Philistine, I've never really considered that, but I have noticed that I prefer the Kenyan beans for making iced coffee because I want it a little bit darker, so that when I ice it and it naturally it waters it down a little bit, then I'm good. I only recently saw this giant map that explained the coffee band. I didn't even understand that all coffee was grown between. I mean, I guess I had heard that it was grown between certain latitudes, but it was, I'm sure it was in a coffee shop and they had a giant world map with a band right in the middle. Like, this is the coffee band. And it sort of went through Asia and South America, Central America, and Africa. And I was like, oh, that's why they don't grow coffee in Canada.
Yeah. One more interesting note on that. If you really want to geek out about coffee production and growing, Alex Gibney has a documentary he produced called Cooked on Netflix that stars Michael Pollan as the sort of narrator but it's an Alex Gibney thing. So if you like his work, this will look and feel just like it. But there's an episode about fermentation. And in that episode, it's a great episode all the way around, but they have at least 15 to 20 minutes devoted to coffee production. And it's awesome. You get to see, and I think they even throw in chocolate beans as well. You get to kind of see how all of that works. And it's just you want to run out and just buy your own beans that you could roast yourself because it's such great food porn. Anyway,
I'll definitely have to check that out. You and I are big Alex Gibney fans, and that Dirty Money series, which he did not direct all of the episodes, but he produced them. I mean, it still has that Alex Gibney feel. So I'm sure Cooked works the same way.
I have to confess, I did not know Dirty Money was an Alex Gibney
production. Oh, wow.
God damn you. Now my Sunday, I'm gonna have to have it out in the background. By the way, for our listeners too, if you care about Alex Gibney's final plug, we learned a week or two ago, I think 2 weeks ago now, that he is producing a documentary about Theranos. So get ready for that. I can't wait. Early 2019 is what we're told on HBO. Oh, God, it's going to be. Anyway, what have you picked this week, sir?
Well, I have got a more or less conventional comic. It's a trade paperback. It's not one of the big two. I picked Descender by Jeff Lemire and Dustin Nguyen. It is what we read this month in the comics book club that I have been attending. So I had read it about a year ago. We read the first volume. So I had read the first volume like a year ago. And I honestly, as a fan of Dustin Nguyen, I still didn't really like it.
Hmm.
My friend Chris was very into the series, and like volume 2 or 3 was coming out at the time. And I don't remember if I read it before I saw Dustin Nguyen at Comic Con, but I'm pretty sure if you go to our 2017 Comic Con wrap up, I tell the story of that image panel, the artist telling stories, and Dustin Nguyen was on it, and he showed some panels from Descender. And so maybe after that, I thought, that looked really interesting, and read it. And then honestly thought, I'm not feeling it, but the story, I thought the sci-fi bit of it was like probably appealing to other people, and so I sent you my copy. And then when knowing it was coming up for book club this month, I honestly thought, you know what, I'm just going to go in like I read it, a year ago. I can get by in a discussion of it, and then recanted that position and thought, no, it's pretty cheap on Comixology for volume 1. It was like $5.99 or something, so I'm just gonna grab it. And I did, and reread it this week, and really, really loved it.
Oh my God.
So
now wait, let me pause right there. Is that because the form factor of digital worked better for you for the story than the printed version?
That is exactly where I was going. I hypothesize that may be the reason. So Dustin Nguyen's artwork is just wonderful all the time, and he's really heavily into watercolors. And when he spoke about this, I believe the story he told was that sometimes he doesn't even do a sketch. He'll just go straight to the canvas and just sort of start working on it. But it's not like, it may be if you are very, very used to the normal way that comics look, and not sort of like Image or other, non-big two books look, it may be kind of bracing to see how much watercolor is in this and how washed it feels, but it still looks like a comic. Like, so the other, so I think just to appreciate the art, you need the printed version, because you actually want to see his big layouts and his pages, because like I said, I think he conceives of those pages all together on one canvas and just starts painting it. I don't know that he paints panel by panel, but I do think the guided view going through dialogue to panel to, I think that helped me follow the story and care about the story more this time. So I'm really torn. I don't know what I would tell people to do. I think if you got it digitally and got into the story, then you're definitely going to appreciate the art, and maybe you can enjoy the rest of the series printed, but maybe if you really loved the art in the printed edition and you want to know the story, maybe this is the way to go. I'm really torn. The other thing I hypothesized for why I maybe didn't like it was because at the time I was very heavily and still am, but most of these series have slowed down. I was still reading Black Science, Saga, Paper Girls, and to pick up another sci-fi title with unconventional comic book art was like, oh boy. So the story is I'm going to avoid all planet names and alien race names and a whole bunch of other technical jargon, because I was definitely struck during this like, boy, I wish we could come up with a common vocabulary for space, because it's kind of like every sci-fi story is describing the same things, like hyperspace, and they give it a new name. It's in Guardians of the Galaxy, it's jumps or whatever. Wasn't that what they called it?
Yeah.
And in it's hyperspace in some things, and in this one they call it shift space.
Okay.
And you're like, oh boy, okay. So there were so many different vocabulary words and planet names and stuff. I'm gonna try to avoid that and give the big bullet points of the story, which are it opens up on this planet that is in a galactic system of like 9 habitable planets, and these giant robots have appeared, and then the robots do some sort of attack on the planet, but it's really not clear. Like one robot appears at every planet, sort of a Pacific Rim kind of thing, except that the robot is as big as the planet basically, and they've just appeared at each planet, and they each attack the planet, and they do some huge amount of destruction, but it's obviously not like totally apocalyptic, because people live to tell the story and persist. But what happens is it creates this huge fear of robots, and all these planets have become really dependent on AI and robotics. And so vigilantes start destroying the robots, the robot culls. And I guess there's even like not just vigilantes, but it's officially sanctioned. So these robots are just being destroyed like in mass to where you don't see them anymore. And oh, sorry, were you about to jump in with a question?
I'm sorry. This is just making me think of either the kind of the origins of the Matrix and the Animatrix. There was that 2-part like anime version of like basically this. We create AI, and then there's like these anti-robot, anti-AI people. But I think even more prescient to me right now is just the Butlerian jihad in the story Dune. It's like the whole point of which it's so fascinating that so many of these epic kind of sci-fi, sci-fantasy stories kind of share similar heritage, even though it's not like, it's not referenced to be the same thing. But like in the context of Dune, the whole reason there's all these like super powered people is because there is a ban on all AI. Like man shall not make robot in his image anymore, because there's this thing called the Butlerian Jihad where basically man went to war against AI and narrowly won. Right. So it's just like every time I hear anything kind of in the same, like kind of early days of what could have evolved into that, I'm always like, man, is this all? It's interesting that we're all sort of thinking about the same things tangentially.
Yeah. Well, in the book club, there are a couple people brought up some Blade Runner comparisons with, and what is this, a robot, or is a replicant a robot, or an android, or are they all androids? And, where do we differentiate there? And then another person made the interesting comparison that this is like a Pinocchio story. Like I want to be a real boy kind of thing.
Okay.
And so there's not a lot of pages spent on the robot culling. Like this is not a story about destroying the robots. We see that event happen. And then 10 years later, and we see it through the eyes of this Dr. Kwan, who's like the father of modern robotics. And 10 years later, jump to 10 years later, they're waking up like this general is like banging on Dr. Kwan's door. And he's like, Dr. Kwan, you've got to see this. And so they take him on this thing, and basically they say, for the past 10 years, we've been trying to find the codex, which is like sort of the base language at the heart of these harvester robots. That's what they call the big giant robots. Because the codex would maybe give them some clues to where they're from and all this kind of stuff. And they've just, in this time, a Tim robot, which is like a companion robot, which looks like a child. This is where the Pinocchio story comes in, has suddenly revitalized itself on this distant mining colony. So Dr. Kwan and then these two military, or maybe not military, but, officers in the United Galactic Council or whatever, they fly out to this mining colony. So you get sort of the vibe of Alien, and they're going to recover this companion robot that looks like a little boy.
Okay.
So this little boy has been given all these like emotion sensors and stuff from Dr.
And he's the character you see on the cover of Volume 1. Right? Okay.
Yeah. And in that time, like, so I guess during that journey, the leader of that group her name is Telsa. So boy, there are way too many Tesla jokes because of that. But her name is Telsa, and she is really aggressively questioning Dr. Kwan, and she tells him the reason we're, like you're being dragged along and all this is because we finally decoded that codex from the harvesters. It's your codex from the Tim robots. So someone has taken this very innocent AI that you created and made these terrible world destroying robots that have now turned all the populations of the 9 habitable planets against robots and AI. So we need to bring this back intact and then, use it as like forensic data basically. But of course they don't get to the planet first. These, whatever they're called again in sci-fi language, reapers or ravagers or harvesters, whatever.
You're right. This does get a little confused. Like,
I know.
It is too, which is sad because, there are things like, obviously, like the Force is very specifically Star Wars. So you can't just say the Force without having and that's even less a like, hey, we're going to get sued, and more like fans are going to be really fucking confused if we try to do that.
Yeah.
Whereas, surely hyperspace can be a universal term by now. Like, maybe Gene Roddenberry owns it for all we know, but it is a little like, don't invent your own cute little variations just for the fun of it.
Yeah. So whatever they're called, get to the planet first. The human population on this mining colony has been wiped out, and this boy. So through flashbacks, we learn how the boy came to live with a family there to be a companion to another young boy there, and came to think of that boy's mother as his own mother, and think of that boy as his brother. And he knows, it's like when they finally talk to him, he is able to say, I know it's not my real mother, but that's how I think of her.
Which is interesting. Okay, so I was going to wait till the end, but this is a great point here. Does this story have the Ex Machina vibe? Not narratively, but just in terms of sort of the subtlety or the way they talk about or perceive AI.
It's just not that deep. It's more there's not like that conflict between a human and created robot. I mean, where there is, it's very explicitly laid down. Like in the, when there's a sort of flashback to Quan creating Tim, he says to him, like, you understand, I am not your father, I'm your creator, but we are going to have you live with a family. And it's very, very, literal and explicit. So they get, before Quan and Telsa can arrive and find Tim, the Ravagers or the Reapers or the Savagers or the Scrappers or whatever they're called show up and start pursuing him. And he has revived his robot dog companion called Bandit. So he and Bandit are like running away. I mean, it's very like a Lassie kind of story, Tim and Bandit running away. And so they're running away from these scavengers, and they run into and activate this other robot, a mining robot that's a driller, which obviously drills through rock. And that driller has come to hate humans. So the driller sets about sort of murdering most of the scavengers that are after them. But then they're still being pursued. And when Telsa and Quan get there, and at that point, the scavengers have blasted Tim. So there's a big thing where they've got to repair him, and they've got to like salvage his memory and put it back into his body before they leave the planet, and blah blah blah. And, some of the confusing parts of the story are where it's sort of flashback / dream sequences or something where the memories are being re-implanted into Tim. But other than that, like this, and this is what's so funny, is that's what I remembered about the book. So it was obviously a sticking point for me a year ago, was feeling like, man, the story's not progressing. I'm just sort of lost in this whole like origin of the robots and stuff like that. But what I got from it on rereading it was I was able to just move through that stuff really quickly. And then the story really progressed. And I felt that it's not as fast paced as that first volume of Black Science, which just feels like pedal to the metal. But it's definitely moving. Like, and of course this group has their troubles trying to get back to whatever the planet Nirata or whatever their planet name is, with Tim. And, it's some of the same beats that you would find in any sci-fi escape story like that. But, I just found myself like really liking it. And there are a couple of characters where you have a first impression of them, and then when you learn something else, it's like totally flips the impression around. And I think I'm gonna proceed with this series now.
Wow.
Yeah,
which is interesting. Okay, so like you had sent me, like you had mentioned earlier, the paperback volume 1, and I had sort of read it, and I've been aware of the series for a little while. It's always kind of been one of those Image titles that's always there. It's always in shops. It looks, unique and interesting, cool. And by the way, Jeff Lemire also is creator of Royal City, which I haven't gotten super into. But he's also the creator, along with Scott Snyder, of AD After Death, which was a limited series that I really, really liked. Also heavily watercolor. And Royal City also heavily watercolor too. So I think Jeff Lemire does the covers for Descender, if I'm not mistaken, as well.
I don't know. I mean, it's very Dustin Nguyen looking.
That's true. Regardless, so Jeff Lemire's got he's got a really cool point of view, and I always keep forgetting he's involved with Descender. And so I had mentioned before that sort of it's almost like there is you tell me if you don't think this, but it almost kind of looks like an Asian, almost anime, but like not even anime. That's the worst way to frame it. Not anime, but like an Asian, like still art kind of vibe to the Descender watercolor. Yeah. Like it's there's a minimalism to it, and sort of just a very kind of, the flourishes remind me of like Japanese, like poetry and images combined. So there's kind of that vibe to it, which I think at first I didn't pull me into the sci-fi aspect of the story so much, but hearing you describe it and just knowing Jeff Lemire is involved, it's like, oh shoot, I need to give this a good second look. And I think digitally might be the way to go. It's fascinating you say that you had a different experience with it digitally. I finally picked up Black Science Volume 1 digitally. And actually like it a lot. And didn't quite, I think here's what it might be for me, and this may have been your situation. Black Science, the art is so very specific and so kind of very unique to what it is, that I think when you open up a book and you see it kind of all there, it's almost a little overwhelming for the eyes to take in. So when you're seeing it on a panel by panel basis, not only can you appreciate it more for what it is, but it lets your brain sort of sink around the story more and not just be like, whoa, what am I, Descender is it is a very, very unique looking book. You're not, to your point, see this.
Yeah. And it's such a soft look, that, like I get that Asian influence thing of you're very aware of the brush work, and the gradients involved are very natural because they're painted, and it's
it's very earth tone too, right? There's a lot of rose and browns and grays, and like they don't really ever get out of that color palette, which is totally intentional. But again, it's very evocative of kind of like that natural, poetic sort of, just more of a not like rock'em sock'em sci-fi, which is kind of what Black Science is, to your point. But it's a framing device for the story that I think you really have to kind of understand before you start reading it.
Yeah. And it's I think my point just totally slipped out of my head. Oh, I'll tell you what it was that, so I will say that when I went back through digitally, I really appreciated the character work. And so that was something that for sure got lost on me on my first read, was that I just didn't appreciate how detailed and unique each different sort of race of aliens was, and things like that. And just doing the guided view, I was very aware of like, oh wow, that is a creepy looking alien, or look at that weapon right there. And there's a couple of and also there's a couple of battles, and there's one scene with some really explicit gore in it. And it just kind of catches you by surprise. Like, oh, I didn't expect that, given this sort of soft tone of everything. And it's actually really, really well rendered. So it's worth thinking about what gets lost on that. I think the difference, Black Science, breaks out of the panel format too, but Black Science is a little bit more panel oriented. Actually, it's probably not. I kind of wonder what both of these books would look like if they had their unique art style but stuck more to a panel format, if that would actually make it more understandable. Like it's 9 tiny canvases you're looking at instead of one giant canvas. I think the sci-fi story doesn't necessarily need to be told in one big canvas. For certain set pieces, sure, but a lot of sci-fi you need to be like in the details, because they're throwing all this vocabulary at you and stuff, and you're like, what the hell are you talking about? So,
well, I'm gonna. I'm assuming you're kind of That's a great transition point for me. So, like, I'm gonna sum up not Black Science. I'm gonna sum up Descender. Good Lord, as one of those books that is almost like a David Bowie album in the 70s. Like, I would imagine, like, if you were a little kid in the 70s, you're like, I'm into music, and you get this David Bowie album, and you're like, what the heck? What? I mean, it's totally not anything you're used to seeing or listening to. And the onus is kind of on you to figure it out. Like it's one of those things where the art is so confident that it's like, look, if you want to expand your perceptions and you want to dig a little deeper, take the time to do so, because you'll be richly rewarded if you do. But this is not going to be, you're going to have to kind of up your game as a reader, or in the case of the 70s with David Bowie, as a listener, to appreciate, which is a great transition point to my pick this week, because that's exactly how I feel about my thing. And I'll preface this by saying, after Todd has wonderfully done 2 really good non-comics picks over the last 2 weeks, which I actually thought was really fun and cool and still fit within the coffee and comics vibe of what we review, but was definitely, were actual just novels. I've got a thing kind of in a similar mindset, and it should be no surprise to you, Todd, what it is, considering that I've been talking about it for the last week. But Amazon Prime recently started re-airing the original episodes of The Prisoner, which was a 1967 British TV series. It was only one series, was only ever meant to be one series, 17 episodes. And it's really the opus project of one Patrick McGoohan. He created it. He wrote a lot of the episodes. He was the showrunner, essentially. He directed a lot of the episodes, and he's the starring character. So this is really his, purely his project. And it is definitely one of those shows that, just like I said, you have to spend the time really trying to figure out. It's there. And yeah, because it was made in the late 60s, there's going to be some, stylistic things. Like some of the editing is really, really terrible. Because you're just like, what? But it's obvious that it was, it's a product of its time. So at that point, people didn't quite understand what editing could be. So you kind of have to you almost have to suspend your disbelief in those situations.
Well, sure. They didn't have computers to find the right point to edit.
That, but just tonally, you're like, man, they could have, it's one of those things where you'll see a scene in the pilot and it'll cut, go, cut, back, cut, just like, oh dude, you guys could have maybe spent another pass at this. But regardless, a lot of it, because it was made in the late 60s for TV, they didn't really shoot outdoors a lot then. And it's almost like a movie, like a 17-hour movie, because a lot of it's really well done. So let me back up. The premise of this show, and again, it was all created by this one guy, is that there's this unnamed man, and you see this in the opening credits of every episode. This unnamed man, he's a secret agent with British intelligence. One day he walks in and just sort of resigns, and you see kind of him yelling at his superior and slamming his fist on the desk. You never really know why, and it doesn't seem like it's even that important. But he's resigned. He goes home and he's in his apartment, and while he's in his apartment, this creepy dude with a overcoat and top hat on sprays some kind of poison or something into his knockout gas into his apartment, and the main guy, the spy, he passes out. He wakes up in a similar kind of space, but instead of being in the middle of downtown London, he is now on this resort island. And he walks out his door, and there's this crazy village around him. And all the people are dressed like Waldo for some weird reason. There's with these stripy shirts on, these kind of beanie hats. And you're just like, what is going on? The whole point of the show, and I'll back up, this entire show is a metaphor. And it's a metaphor for many different things, but you should not watch this show literally. It's all about individualism versus groupthink. It's about how society can impose its will on you sometimes, even if you don't want it to be. It's about subverting expectations. It's about being, really figuring out who you are in the world and sticking to that, and not letting that idea of yourself being co-opted by either culture or economies or even your friends and family. It's about so many different things, but it's kind of packaged in this framework of this spy is now here, and then they're all hell-bent on trying to get him to explain why he resigned. And you can take that even as a metaphor for he's resigned from culture. He's resigned from systems of society, and it's, the systems are wanting to know why. The systems are fighting back. So they put this character, and the moment he ends up in this village, he's referred to as number 6. Everybody in this village is assigned a number. You never know their names, and that's intentional You never ever find out his real name. It's not even that important. They just refer to him as either Sir eventually or number 6. And so you come to know him as 6. And, he's rebelling against that. He's like, look, I'm not, even in the opening credits, he screams out, I am not a number. I'm a man. I'm an individual. So that's always kind of, put in front of you. The main antagonist in this show, and one of the reasons I'm really kind of fascinated by this program, is a character called Number 2. And he, for all intents and purposes, is the one in charge. And you never find out, well, you're always left to wonder, well, who is number 1? If this is number 2, who does he answer to? And you get some glimpses of that. And obviously 6 is always trying to figure that out because he wants to know who put him here. Why is he here? Why can't he escape from this village? And number 2 is kind of his antagonist. Number 2's job is to figure out why he resigned, to try to get 6 to conform to the society they've built. The interesting thing about number 2 is it's always played by a different actor in every episode. And they bring out these incredibly heavy hitter British actors of the time to play number 2. A lot of them are men, but every once in a while you'll see a woman pop up, which is kind of cool. And it's never really like, they never make a big deal about the fact that there's a different actor every time. In fact, in the opening credits, they usually show you, they rerun the same scene every time in the opening credits of how the guy got to the island, or not the island, but to the village and got to be 6. And at the very end of that, there is, the number 2 chair rises and turns around, and that typically reveals who the number 2 in that episode is. And that actor will repeat the same line that is always repeated in the opening credits. You're like, oh, cool, this is who it's going to be.
Is it a position like M in the James Bond universe?
A little bit, yeah. Okay. Very similar. So they really lean. It's interesting because on the surface, it's a show about this spy who, this other sort of maybe more secretive spy organization is trying to get information out of. But you can't watch it literally like that. It's going to drive you nuts. You have to, because it's not about that. It's about all this deeper meaning and all these metaphors.
Because of that, is it kind of difficult to get into? I mean,
yes. Oh, okay. Yes. And I'll just announce this now because this is probably this will probably help. We're actually hopefully going to be starting. I and Charles Wefso, who's another host on their network, we're going to be doing a prisoner companion show because Charles is really, really interested in this show. I've just gotten interested in it, and we're going to do a podcast that just covers each episode because I think there's so much to dig into that if you just you watch an episode and you desperately want to talk to somebody about it because you want to understand it better. You want to know like what was going on here. Like some of it's so confusing that you're just like, you almost want like a therapy session just to like get it out of your system or out of your head. So there's a lot of that. So number 2 is kind of the antagonist. And there's, what's great about a different actor playing it every episode is that it's always the same kind of, they treat it like the same core character, but you get to see it through a different actor's eyes every episode. So one episode, number 2 might be much more sadistic and much more authoritarian, like Big Brother in that regard. Another episode, number 2 might be much more, kind of friendly and cat and mouse playing and just more like, almost kind of like Moriarty, with Sherlock. Another episode, number 2 might be completely suave and debonair and just like, you almost want to root for him or her. Another episode, number 2 might be way more paranoid and delusional and David Miscavige-like. And you're like, oh my God. And I'm not even, I bring that up intentionally too, because there are some of these episodes where you're left there watching going, oh my God, it's like somebody has dramatized Scientology. And it's like, I'm not even joking. Like you're watching this going, is this like Scientology was around then, but nothing, nobody really knew about it.
Right. Yeah.
No way for it to influence pop culture. But you're watching this going, God damn it. If I didn't know better, I'd think that like, Patrick McGoohan was intentionally trying to parody, this guy living in the Sea Org.
Well, just me looking at pictures of the village online, I'm like when you said that, I immediately went, yep, those are Scientology buildings. It's like the number of times you think that it just keeps going. Like I'm now about halfway through watching these episodes, and it's just like, man, there's a lot of, if you're a Scientology watcher, as we are, there's a lot of interesting parallels here. Even the fact that, take the idea of number 2
who is number one in Scientology? Well, LRH, but we don't ever see him anymore. I mean, he's dead, obviously, but we don't see him. But his influence is there. So like Miscavige is number two. So there's a lot of weird. If you watch it in that context, it gets kind of trippy and surreal.
LRH he had to do some outer body work to bring back the higher levels. Yeah. I don't know if you were listening.
This work has to be done totally exterior from the body.
Yeah, exactly.
So a couple more interesting points here. The episodes, other than the pilot and then the last two episodes, there is a lot of debate over which order these episodes should go in. And there's not, Patrick McGoohan has died, and he died in 2009. So there's no, he can't chime in on this. So the BBC had an order for the episodes that was different than what PBS ran in the 80s or 90s, which is different from what AMC put out on their DVD series, which is also what Prime is using the AMC DVD order.
Man.
Now,
okay.
Here's why this doesn't matter. Between the pilot and the last two episodes absolutely have to go in that order because they're the only two episodes that are connected to each other in a very intentional way. But the episodes in between, you could mix and match, and it doesn't necessarily change the narrative of the story because it's all about him trying to get out of the village. It doesn't really, episodes don't carry over into other episodes really at all. So you could mix and match and rewatch them in a different order and have it kind of be a different kind of show, but you still get to that same ending regardless. It all paths end and coalesce at those last two episodes. So it's almost like this puzzle box that was set up to be a puzzle box, but there's any variety of answers to it. And I don't know if Patrick McGoohan had that in mind. It's really crazy. You want to watch this show and have Wikipedia up and ready on your iPad as you're doing it, because apparently as the show went on, Patrick McGoohan became even more sort of dictatorial in his creative choices and kind of made the cast and crew nuts. And he started drinking, so he became kind of abusive on set too, verbally and everything. So it's the whole show kind of becomes this metaphor for Patrick McGoohan's own life. And so you're just how did this get funded? Because this is Twin Peaks 25 years before Twin Peaks. This is 1967. So you got to wonder how did he convince anybody to give him money for this? Because this was, even for today, this would be very cutting edge, avant-garde kind of TV. In 1967, this was this is from another world almost. Strangely enough, it was launched the same year Monty Python's Flying Circus came out. So keep that in mind. But, think about all of that as you're watching this show. And then think about the fact that in 2009, AMC did a reboot, a limited miniseries reboot of The Prisoner that was very much based on the premise of the show, but it went in a very different direction, both stylistically, but also narratively. Who number two in the reboot, Ian McKellen plays number 2, Jim Caviezel plays number 6. And so it's it starts in the same place, but it ends wildly different and it starts to become about something else entirely than what the 60s series is about, which is fine. There was no way they were going to just remake that original 60s series. It is so sui generis. It's just got to stand on its own.
Now, do you have you watched all of the episodes now?
I've watched, there are 17 total. I have watched 8 of them. So I've got a little way to go.
Do you have you watched any of the 2009 series?
Do you think
you would?
Yeah. No, I back in 2009 when that came out, I both loved it and bought it. And so I've been familiar with the property since 2009, and I've been wanting to always go back and watch the original 60s series too. But it's just, I never wanted to buy them all. And I'm like, well, surely this will be on streaming at some point. And then it just never was. And now it finally is on Prime, which leads me to wonder if, I almost wondered, sometimes Prime will do this when they're interested in potentially acquiring the rights to a property or relaunching it, as a new show or something. So I wouldn't be surprised if you see that 2009 series appear on Prime too. I wouldn't be surprised if Amazon isn't considering trying to relaunch The Prisoner. Just throwing that out there.
I was going to ask along those lines, are you aware of, is there any extended universe that's kind of come out of this? Are there books or comic books or anything?
Oh my God. I'm so glad you asked this, Todd. It's the perfect transition because at the same time, it may have even been the same day. If it wasn't the same day, it was at least the next day. I discovered this last Saturday. And on Monday of last week, I went into our local comic shop here in Manitou Springs, which is, small and quaint. Doesn't have that greatest of selection. It's pretty much a big two kind of shop. But on one of the spinner racks, I happened to see 4 issues of The Prisoner graphic novel as published by DC in the late 80s. And there's A, B, C, D, and there's 4 of them. And I bought them all for $10 total. I was just like, and they're all in pristine condition. So this is the only piece of spinoff media that Patrick McGowan signed off his likeness to be. Like, he basically authorized it and then gave them, because his likeness is portrayed in it.
Yeah.
And so it is meant to be a direct sequel to the series. It's not clear how much. I'm still getting through that. I don't know how much time has passed from the ending of the series and this, but it is just as crazy and interesting and convoluted and infuriating as the show, and sucks you in just as much. And I'm not even joking. Like, I see the series, I walk into the comic shop, it's not even just that they had one, they had the entire set on the spinner rack. I'm like, oh my God, I may be living in this show. Like, I need this right now. So that I grabbed that.
That's just the kind of thing that Miscavige would do to you.
And I'm telling you, like, this show, you have to, this is not you don't want to just binge this or mainline this for your whole day. Like, I can only watch this maybe 2 at a time total. Ooh. Because there's so much to take in, and it kind of starts to mess with your own mind, because you're like, wow, you start to ponder all the different metaphor. You start to ponder all the different, man, what was he trying to comment on with this episode? What was the budget like for this one? Because some of the episodes are really well made and directed, and some of them are a little rough. And so you're balancing all that. It is for anybody who likes comics, anybody who likes sci-fi, like anybody who likes any of the TV shows we take for granted today. So Game of Thrones, Breaking Bad, Carnival, obviously Twin Peaks, any of this, like these heavy hitting genre shows. I would argue, somebody correct me if this is wrong, but The Prisoner circa 1967 might be the genesis point for all of this. Because I can't find a single example of a show at this level anytime before this where you're like, my God, every show that we see today almost owes something to the DNA of this series.
I would think that's probably true, because I have always heard it talked about in those terms of sort of the show that came before, all of our series.
Well, I typically Twin Peaks is referenced as kind of like that was the show that changed the game, and that might be true in America because that was truly that was an American produced show. But man, The Prisoner is Twin. You're just as confused and just as intrigued watching The Prisoner as you are that first season of Twin Peaks. We're just like, what the hell is going on? And it does not cater to the audience at all. Like, it is on you to try to figure out what the hell he was intending. Even to the point where I jumped ahead and watched the last 2 episodes because I'm like, I got to see where this is headed. And I heard through just all my reading and background reading that the last episode was it was supposed to be one of the most confusing, infuriating pieces of television ever produced. And actually, after it aired, created riots. Fans of the show would show up at Patrick McGowan's house demanding an explanation. And so he had to flee the country for a month because it was so frustrating. And, today we would be talking about it online like, oh my God, and we'd be complaining about it. But like, imagine this then. Like, TV viewers must have just been like out of their minds, like, what? And so I watched it. I watched that last episode. And sure enough, it is, man, as confusing as some of these interim episodes are, that last one is very, very, very hard to wrap your head around. So I may have to watch that sucker 6 more times before I finally have an understanding,
It definitely sounds like the perfect show that needs like an accompanying podcast to be an explainer and commiserator with the confusion.
Yes. Yeah. So I can't wait to do that. But I it's my pick this week because there's a really awesome comics tie-in, which I'm so glad you asked about. But also just as anybody who likes the show, who likes the books we like, who's independent, highly creative storytelling. Oh my God, this is a show for you. And it's one of those shows that's always been on my radar, as I'm sure for many people. Same thing. It's like, it's just always in your orbit. And now that it's on Prime, man, it's a great time to jump in. I can't wait to finish it up. I'm becoming more obsessed with it as I get further into it, which may or may not be a good thing. I don't know. I don't know if that is. I may end up being just as crazy as Patrick McGowan is in the show by the time it's done.
Well, I love, just like you appreciated those novels that I picked. I love hearing, tangential media that is related to coffee and comics. So it's a cool way to use our time to discuss it.
Oh, absolutely. So I'll be back next week with a more traditional, conventional pick. But in the meantime, go check out The Prisoner and go check out Descender Volume 1. Yes.
And where can people find us?
You can find us online anywhere podcasts are found. I guess it's redundant. Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Play, Pocket Casts, anywhere but Spotify. Still working on Spotify. I think we're close. Pippa is our distribution platform, and they're getting closer. Also, we are at findusthere.org. That's where you can find this and other shows we've done. And hopefully, if we get this Prisoner watching podcast up and running, you'll find that there too.
Awesome. Anything you want to shout out, personal network wise or anything?
No, I always say I'm by Taylor Trask on Instagram. So find me there. And I think you're on Instagram too.
I'm Hey Todd A. Cool. Well, next week, maybe we'll have 2 comic books, but, hopefully if you enjoyed this episode, you'll enjoy the last 2 where I talked about novels and, and you talked about a single issue one time. So
I do a very important single issue. I'm still, man, the origins of Galactus are really, I just keep thinking about, like, if the MCU can stay strong for another 10 years, if they can figure out a way to do Galactus as like a true, just like, where Thor hears the word Galactus and he's just like, he just shudders with fear, like that could be really
I'm sure you were going to say shits his pants.
Or that, like, I mean,
Thor just shudders.
Shudders with fear. No, it's more Shakespearean to shudder with fear.
Yeah, exactly.
But check that out too. There's more to come. But anyway, until next week.
Yes, we will see you then.